This is part one of a story that combines the horror of battle with the way we now honor our fallen veteran soldiers on a global and a national scale. I must caution you that when I talk about World War I in a few minutes, there's going to be a short historic video that will be disturbing to sensitive people. It's not meant for children or anyone else who would be upset by images of the dead. Now, I'm going to give you a warning before that video plays, and I'll provide you a link below that will allow you to skip over that section. Our story connects us with the national cemeteries, our Civil War, and all of the wars that have followed. Now, you may think that our country has always brought home fallen soldiers, whether it be from the Gettysburg battlefield or the sweltering Philippine jungle, but you'd be wrong. Early on, only American officers were returned to their homes for burial. Sometimes, the family would have to pay for their loved one to be returned, and only occasionally would the government absorb the cost. That was usually only done for a high-ranking soldier or sailor. Prior to the Civil War, most casualties were buried where they fell, and many in mass graves. High-ranking officers whose families either had money, influence, or both could sometimes have their relatives returned. But with the primitive transportation of a time, return of large numbers of bodies was nearly impossible. Over 14,000 American soldiers died during the war with Mexico in the mid-1840s. However, only about 750 of them were recovered and brought back home. None of the rest were even identified, let alone had their graves marked. The carnage of the American Civil War changed all of that. With over 750,000 dead, many of them lying on the battlefield for days before burial, coupled with the fact that these were civilian soldiers for the most part, and not professionals. It was decided that these fighting men deserved respect. In September of 1861, the Army was ordered to begin a program to identify and record the grave location of as many of the fallen veterans as possible. Until hostilities ended, the fallen were often buried in a nearby cemetery, and sometimes even in makeshift cemeteries close to where they fell. In July 1862, President Lincoln signed legislation that allowed the Army to establish the country's first of 14 national cemeteries. After the war, bodies were moved and reburied into these new cemeteries. That project took 5 years and recovered over 90% of the men who had sacrificed their lives for the Union. It wasn't even until the Spanish-American War that the government began sending enlisted men's bodies home for burial. But then only if the parents asked for it. For the first time, parents were actually given a choice. Now, the New York Times newspaper called that an innovation in the world's history of warfare. On April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson addressed a special session of Congress asking for a declaration of war against Germany. "There are," he said, "many months of fiery trial and sacrifice ahead of us. It's a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars." The country rallied and almost eagerly welcomed the chance to fight. Less than 6 months later, the casualties began to mount, and mothers and fathers began to realize that their sons might never be coming home again. In fact, by war's end, in November of 1918, over 70,000 sons were lying dead in scattered European and Asian cemeteries. Families understandably wanted their sons and husbands returned, but there was a war going on, of course, and these were not the days when casualties could be quickly airlifted back to the United States. With wildly scattered bodies lying in shallow graves all across the countryside, with only dirt and graveled roads leading to seaports, and the logistics of war taking priority, General Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, called the idea of returning the fallen men impractical. He said it was also important that the families be spared from seeing the horrific wounds inflicted on their loved ones by modern warfare. When the war ended in 1918, parents and families began an ever louder demand that their soldiers' bodies must come home. "My son sacrificed his life for America's call," said one mother, "and now you must, as a duty of yours, bring my son back to me." A year later, in October 1919, the War Department finally gave in. The families of every fallen soldier were given two choices: proper burial of their loved ones in a new American cemetery, or return of those remains to America. There were some reservations, although they were thankful that the Americans had helped assure victory in the war. French and other Allied officials were not very happy with the idea of exhuming bodies and long trains of casket-carrying trucks and wagons passing through the countryside for months and even maybe years. But finally, they relented. Most of us have never seen the films of what is often called the repatriation of veterans. Few Americans ever read or heard the details of how the Graves Registration Service went about its tedious and horrifying work. This must have been the most unpleasant work imaginable, yet it was carried on by a small corps of deeply dedicated people. This is where I want to give you that promised warning that the historic video, not meant for children or sensitive viewers, is about to start. Now, if you stop this video right now and click on the More link button below, you'll find a time link that, if you click on it, will move you ahead and bypass this sensitive video. Now, please remember that these men are doing the work to honor these soldiers and to bring closure to the families of these men. Here is a brief description of the procedure, as reported by American newspaper correspondent Guy Hickok. In the cold, windswept desert of northern France, American officers and men are working hard these short winter days, exhuming the bodies of American soldiers and preparing them for shipment home. The difficult work of preparing bodies to go home is done by a small group of Americans, many of them ex-soldiers, working under the supervision of Army officers. The manual labor, exhumation, and the transportation of the bodies from the cemeteries to the railroad is done by foreign labor and always supervised by Americans. This very difficult and delicate task is being done with a maximum of dignity and reverence. Now, here and there, among the little garden of white crosses, fresh earth shows where graves have been opened. A workman plods toward a shed, pushing a wheelbarrow filled with these tiny white crosses. Crosses that are no longer needed. On the far side stands something like a tent without a roof, with burlap stretched over upright stakes for its walls. These flapping walls of burlap keep morbidly prying eyes from seeing what's going on inside. From time to time, stretcher bearers, carrying something between them, go into the enclosure and come out again empty-handed. A stone's throw away, at the base of the hill, lay a half-dozen long wooden boxes stacked upon each other, each containing a casket that's ready for transport to the railroad a half-hour away. The grave's registration service officials exercise the utmost care and caution in their work. Preparation of what remains of the bodies for transport home in these new coffins is all done as reverently as possible. Near the railroad, a little freight station is now a storehouse for the dead, who are ready to be shipped. Here on the floor, in several rows, lie the coffins, each covered with an American flag. When a trainload has accumulated, they're carefully conveyed to a seaport, each carload watched over by an ex-soldier. He will not leave these coffins in his charge from the moment the train steams out until they're taken over by the port authority and put aboard a ship. Once the coffins reached the United States, they were continually accompanied by someone, usually a soldier, until they were released to the family. The families of some 30,000 fallen soldiers decided to leave their men buried in the newly constructed European cemeteries. Over 46,000 of the dead were actually brought home. And those flags placed on their coffins in France remained in place and were given to the families when the body returned. The entire operation was paid for by the U.S. government at a cost at the time of about $35 million. Now that's over $250 million at the time this video was recorded. Now, while some were returning home, the American soldiers remaining in France were also being disinterred and moved to the new American cemeteries. This was also the time when the body of the first unknown soldier was selected and brought to Washington, D.C. to be entombed in Arlington National Cemetery. I'll tell that story, part 2, next time. Thanks for watching. Hey, we'll see you real soon with something brand new. Now don't forget to subscribe and maybe give us a thumbs up. Have a great day and an even better tomorrow.